press the bell icon on the YouTube app and never miss another update.
That we are suspending national security, we are suspending security assistance only to Pakistan at this time. Until the Pakistani government takes decisive action against groups, including the Afghan Taliban and the Haqqani network, we consider them to be destabilizing the region and also targeting U.S. personnel. The United States will suspend that kind of security assistance to Pakistan.
Welcome back. That was the U.S. State Department confirming the suspension of security assistance to Pakistan. Now, to discuss this further on this week's Think Tank Central, I am joined by Dr. Aqab Malik from the National Defense University in Islamabad, Pakistan, and from Washington, D.C., Dr. Michael Kugelman, Deputy Director of the South Asia Program at the Wilson Center. Welcome, gentlemen, and thank you for joining me. Dr. Kugelman, I want to start with you. You quoted a source inside the Trump administration as saying there's more than $2 billion at stake in regard to this policy. What exactly does that consist of?
Well, effectively, the Trump administration has indicated that just about all of the U.S. security assistance to Pakistan will be suspended. Not permanently cut, but suspended. And I think there's been a lot of conflicting information as to how much money that could entail. But I think that what we're looking at realistically is somewhere just about at $2 billion. So it's a fair amount of money. But at the end of the day, I don't necessarily think that the amount of aid that the U.S. plans to suspend will actually get Pakistan to do the things that the U.S. wants it to do, which of course is to cut ties to terrorists that the U.S. believes Pakistan provides sanctuary for and essentially goes after Americans in Afghanistan. So I think in the days ahead we'll get a bit more clarity as to how much money exactly is going to be suspended.
Now, Dr. Malik, Pakistan is reportedly hiking a toll tax of containers carrying ammunition and other military hardware for U.S. and NATO troops to Afghanistan by a massive 100%. What other steps are being considered?
Well, you have to look at it this way. For many years, Pakistan has allowed a free access and transit of American armaments and supplies and logistics through Pakistan into Afghanistan to fight a war in Afghanistan in support of the United States and its actions in Afghanistan against the Afghan Taliban and Al-Qaeda and other non-state actors. However, throughout that time, there have been conflicting issues as far as crossing red lines in 2011, for example, the Salala attack on the post, which killed quite a couple of score of Pakistani military. So these border issues will continue. The thing with this tax is that Pakistan has a right to impose certain tax, given that the United States is not reimbursing Pakistan for the coalition support funds that it agreed to do so for the operation that Pakistan is conducting against militants and extremists and terrorists in the frontier area at a large cost to itself. And it disregards the extent of the actions and the military operations that are taking place in Pakistan that have been established and accepted by even the British military as extremely successful. So charging rightfully for access to Pakistan territory to supply logistics to Afghanistan is not an issue. I think fundamentally it's not about the numbers. It's about the imposition on Pakistan to go against its own national interests.
Dr. Kugelman, really quickly, can this have an effect on coalition efforts in neighboring Afghanistan?
Well, I think it remains to be seen. I think the big question now is what happens after this aid freeze. And I think as was discussed before, I believe Pakistan has used one of its main tools of leverage over the U.S. previously. It's shut down the supply routes in Pakistan used by NATO to access Afghanistan. If that were to happen again, and I don't actually think that Pakistan is going to be in a big hurry to shut down the supply routes just yet, but if that were to happen again, Absolutely. I think that, that would make U.S. warfighting efforts in Afghanistan even more challenging than they already are, simply because it would have to depend on alternate supply routes in Central Asia, which are much more expensive and more circuitous than the preferred route through Pakistan. And given that U.S.-Russia relations are in such a problematic stage right now, I think it will be very difficult for the U.S. to negotiate an arrangement with Russia to allow the U.S. to use those supply routes. And the U.S. is struggling enough in Afghanistan. I certainly would admit that. I mean, the Taliban has arguably hasn't controlled as much territory, or controls more territory in Afghanistan now than at any time since U.S. forces entered the country in 2001. And if the U.S. has to somehow figure out how to secure alternate supply lines, ground lines into Afghanistan, that could be really problematic. So this is why, I've been highlighting the fact that for all this talk about how the U.S. government may be taking a harder line on Pakistan by using pressure tactics and even punitive measures, if the U.S. pushes hard enough, Pakistan could feel sufficiently provoked that it would shut down those supply lines.
Dr. Malik, do you agree with what Dr. Kugelman is saying?
Well, I do understand and that the United States has a lot of commitments in Afghanistan. It's got a number of bases that it wants to maintain. I think it's a question of rationale as to why they want to remain in Afghanistan more than anything else. I think more than anything else, we've got to come to terms with the fact that this war will drag on and on and on and be detrimental to the region in general for a long time to come, unless there's some determined effort to come to some form of resolution. And I think that this approximately 4,000 troops that have been admitted into Afghanistan won't do that much substantial difference. But when it comes down to that, I think it's more a negotiation strategy. It's a recognition that I think the United States already understands that Taliban, whether we like it or not, is going to have to come to some form of understanding with them. The United States has to, as is the region. They fought a war that is detrimental to the region and international peace and security, but they see it from a different rationale altogether. And we've got to come to some understanding so we can have some peace and security, and we can try to flourish and prosper through access of trade in Central Asia, for example.
Dr. Kugelman, really quickly, you mentioned that this funding has been suspended, not canceled. Is there a way back from this?
Well, yeah, the U.S. government has made it very clear that if Pakistan starts to crack down on these terrorists on its soil in ways that the U.S. wanted to, then the U.S. would resume the aid. I think essentially the U.S. is asking Pakistan to not necessarily shut down these sanctuaries used by the Afghan Taliban and the Haqqani network, but basically making it harder for these groups to operate and ensuring that there's no communication or links between individual Pakistani military or security establishment officials and these militants. In my own view, is it's going to take a long time to get to that point. I think that every country has its own interests, and Pakistan has its own interests, and unfortunately, its interests entail maintaining links to the likes of the Taliban and the Haqqani network, because among other things, they help push back against the presence and influence of India, Pakistan's enemy, in Afghanistan. And I think that, it's going to take a lot more than aid freezes and pressure tactics to get Pakistan to change its calculus.
Well, we will definitely keep an eye on how this plays out. Dr. Michael Kugelman and Dr. Aqab Malik, thank you both so much for joining me today. It was a pleasure.